Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out live onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads, and even living room televisions. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio producer. These talks are a chance for us to throw open the digital doors of the studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio, for whom this may be the first time you're engaging with what we do. For all those newcomers, here's a little bit about what we do. The studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol, and we are a home for early stage ideas and companies and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. We're a studio space predominantly with hot desks available for all our residents, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, and we offer all of that for free. We are a safe place for artists, creatives and companies to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. Today's speaker is one of our studio residents. It's Dr. Edson Burton, who is a writer, historian, programme curator and performer based in Bristol. His academic specialisms include Bristol and the transatlantic slave trade, Black history in the USA, and cultural continuities between Africa and the New World. Edson's going to discuss some of his work and a project that he developed as part of a residency he did here at the studio. There's a Q&A at the end with the talk running around 30 to 35 minutes. We'll be posting links to the things that Edson references after the talk, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to ask questions, just pop them into the chat window and I'll pick them out to ask Edson later on at the end of the talk. Please remember, if you do want to do that, you need to be signed into a Google account to post into the chat window, and do feel free to post as we go. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. Next week, there isn't a talk because it's a bank holiday, and even in these times where time seems meaningless, we are observing that one. More info on our talk for the following week will be available on the website shortly, and you can get news on all our future talks by following us on PM Studio UK or subscribing to our newsletter on this website, on our website. Please don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up, and share the link when it's done, because you can share it with your friends and they can watch it here again. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Edson Burton, and I will see you again for the Q&A.
Afternoon, everyone. So what I'm going to do with today's talk is take you through my inspiration for the last blues song, but also how Afrofuturism generally, which wasn't inspired the last blues song, has informed my creativity across the board. And then to give you a bit of a recap about where the last blues song is at. Last blues song being a project I began with the PM Studio in 2015, 2016. So it's been a while. What's going on? But I want to take us right back, and I think this is important to getting a sense of my creative practice and how Afrofuturism has helped to shape that and being part of it. I want to go back a bit to a little bit of biog. So, Afrofuturism, a home for aliens. And I guess that as I've been considering my work, often we create work without sort of thinking consciously as what's the informing principles. And then it starts to make sense, these different projects that we've worked in. So Afrofuturism, a home for aliens, was really me beginning to investigate my own journey as a writer and a curator. And I realized that I had many of the ingredients in my growing up, in my formative years, which made Afrofuturism something that I would be attracted to. So just to get a little bit of a rundown, I grew up with I suppose in a sense, writing and art generally, creativity generally, often attracts those who feel that a sense of being engaged or part of a wider polity or community and so on is sometimes a struggle, that we carry a sense of detachment, which is on the one hand troubling and rewarding. It might make us able to create, but it might also make you feel slightly out of step emotionally with the world that surrounds. Not true for everyone, but I think a number of creatives that I speak to sort of share this sense of remove. But also, I think more concretely, in my background, there's a sense of alienation, detachment, which comes from, I think, a unique set of life perspectives. So I grew up in a small town, Bedford in England, Bedfordshire, and it's a very multicultural town. And I grew up in a mixed Caribbean household. So I'm living in Bristol, and Bristol's predominantly Jamaican in terms of the community that settled here in the 60s and 70s. So my parents actually were mixed Caribbean marriage. My father was from Jamaica. My father's pictured in the screen. And my mother was from the island called Nevis. Lots of people say, where is Nevis? It is part of the Caribbean. I went to a POC, being people of color, majority church, but it was white-led. Again, while many people in the African Caribbean community went to a black-led churches, we moved house frequently. So we were, on the one hand, living in a Caribbean environment, neighborhood, but some actually more multicultural. So quite a significant constituency from South Asia, Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu living in the area. And then we moved frequently to other parts of town. Now I attended a school which, again, was predominantly it's predominantly people of color students, where aspirations were high, but attainment were low. We all thought we could be doctors, we could be lawyers, we could be Rambo. That was the fantasy at the time. But actually, I think we weren't really aware throughout our educations at that time, that how, in a sense, our sense of our achievements, our potentialities, weren't held in the same regard as our school environment. And this was before, I guess, a sense of institutional racism, or even in the legal system, those terms even had come into parlance. So in many ways, I grew up in an environment which didn't match and my dreamer qualities, my aspirations, both academically and creatively. And of course, I grew up in Thatcher's Britain, where a kind of racialized language around immigration that we've actually pre-COVID began to see returning with the Brexit debate. This was common parlance. Oh, and just to make matters even more complicated and odd, my two alter egos were Prince and Jesus. How do you put Prince and Jesus together? Not going to be an easy one. So I looked for superheroes that mirrored me. And I think of the Black superheroes, the Black Panther and Luke Cage. So just before that. But before finding those heroes, I had sought for a kind of an imaginative escape from the sense of alienation remove in pulp fictions. So don't know if anyone out there has read Robert E. Howard, who inspired the great Conan films, and Tarzan, of course, which has gone through many avatars. But these were the books that I grew up reading. And the problem was that I was absent from them. Me, as this Black British kid, wasn't present in this literature. Or, even more problematically, when I was present, I was the savage other. Both of those pulp fictions that I cite sort of rested on these ideas of innate white nobility. So I found my mirror reflected in the comic book genres of Black Panther and Luke Cage, to reference before. Or the more inclusive worlds of Star Trek, and if anyone out there remembers Space 1999 with Commander Koning. Okay, I'm giving away my age, but anyway. So those inclusive worlds, again, gave a different portrait as to what was possible. But on the other hand, they very much depended upon the white captain. So we were great kind of adjuncts and lieutenants. And I say we, of course, I'm talking about my Black subjectivity, but we were not the leaders. So the alien finds a home. And through my sixth form journey and as a young student growing up through my BA through to my MA, and still now, I discovered Marcus Garvey, who was the leader of the largest Pan-African organization. It's still in existence to this day, so like 10 million members. And Marcus Garvey led the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. I discovered Rastafari through my older brother, and that meant I really began to get a sense, in a grassroots way, not an academic way, of a sort of Black Pride movement. I discovered Malcolm X, as many of us did in the 80s. And then the Black Panther movement, political Pan-Africanism later in life, and then the problematic to my own positionality within this increasingly in sort of white spaces of academia. Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Mask made a lot of sense of the internalized racism that I had grown up with among Black peers, at school level and so on. It helped to explain my environment. But I began to question whether or not those escapes that I found, that kind of political conscience raising, wasn't in a sense still a conversation with whiteness, rather than really an attempt to excavate what are the potentialities of Blackness. So one of the things that occurred to me during my, my years as a student at the School of Oriental African Studies was to what extent that the conversation within Pan-Africanism, within Black activism and Black radicalism generally, really was recreating a conversation with whiteness in a binary way. That if you are the, so that in a sense, we are the opposite to what is posited by the West, or the West is less than Africa, in various different ways. But it's still the same conversation, just creates a binary response to it. Then also within that activism, and not always, but there was a strain in which Blackness becomes essentialized. So I called it Policing Blackness, and borrowed a song by Billy Paul, Am I Black Enough for You? Which not necessarily was referring to the essentialism, but I think it kind of captures a sense that many of us who found ourselves in the cracks, these artists, detached, geeks, whatever else, found that we weren't necessarily signed up sufficiently to the roster of what Blackness is. We were policed out of belonging. Then, of course, you have Afro-essentialism versus multiculturalism. How do you exist with this, in this plural world in which your influences and your sense of home is displaced and is plural and is heterogeneous? Put it in a different way. Is it possible to both enjoy David Bowie and Dead Prez? I think it is. These are some of the concerns that I experienced when I was growing up. But I found that in recent years, hashtag culture of resistance in some ways still led me to think, are we not still involved in this binary discussion of Blackness? In a sense, are we not so often reacting to the positions that are created by white power as opposed to excavating our potentiality? This isn't to say, of course, that this challenge isn't necessary, but what I think is that we sometimes lose sight of what are the new spaces that we can reach, both in a dialectical sense of people of Black or African descent, and also as a wider societies in which Blackness is recognized as having an energizing power and force. So decolonization, why is my curriculum so white? Cultural appropriation, colorism, white privilege, why are the Oscars so white? It seems that so much of our interest is brought up, is concerned and focused upon this struggle with white power. But what is left of us and our abilities to think about our potentialities? I began to think about what is possible beyond a conversation with whiteness. And I thought, when I first began to encounter Afrofuturism, I thought, well, isn't there in some ways a similar sense that we're borrowing tropes from whiteness and just kind of flipping them with a sort of black lens. And I should say that one of the major things for my academic journey was discovering at SOAS a whole different range of philosophies and concepts and ways of, and ontologies and ways of thinking about blackness, which were part of the African worldview and those heterogeneous, diverse cultures prior to colonialism. And that we in the diaspora, in some ways, feel that have been lost. But through my own experience of teaching cultural continuities, actually haven't been lost in the way that we've been led to think. But politically, we engage less with that as a blueprint, as a launch pad for thinking about Black potentialities than we do, in a sense, with the struggle with whiteness. So some of the problematics I encountered in pop Afrofuturism for me was still this sense of white tropes as blueprints, whether or not it's notions of masculinity, femininity, whether it's also an idea of a sort of negritudian purity. We know that no cultures are pure. We know that we borrow and we make new things out of each other's stuff, right? That's what globalization does. But in this attempt to find ourselves, I think there's an insistence on this kind of purity, which I think is problematic. So I began to think, what if blackness was not based on a reaction, not based on a reaction to whiteness? What if blackness did not even exist? What if that's not the first thing that I consider when I get up in the morning? What if the world doesn't see me as Black? What if, in essence, the N-word never existed? And that actually, in some ways, I think could almost be the summation of what I'm trying to do, because that word carries so much of the pejorative power of white supremacy. It carries so much of the sense of the erasure of people of African descent as human beings. And it's that term at its most bestial that I think we are still struggling against. What would be the aesthetic, political, and societal values of a decolonized Black state? What if, in a sense, to borrow from my SOAS experience, and we were to be able to somehow start consider or envision a society that, in a sense, began with a different blueprint, didn't begin with a reaction to colonialism or slavery or white supremacy in its macro or micro forms. I should say that prior to the last blues song, I'd already begun to explore speculative fiction in my creative writing. I find myself either doing really gritty realism, something's happening on the streets, and it's, you know, that kind of stuff, or being quite mythic and imaginative stuff. Because in some ways I found that gave me the freedom. I think very early on, instinctually, I realized a kind of freedom to posit alternative spaces, to look at struggles in a more, you know, Brechtian theatre and so on, which I'd kind of loosely encountered at university. So one of my first forays was the Ithaca Access, which was a promenade performance, which myself and my collaborator, Nick Young, put together as part of the Trinity Centre in Bristol. So we imagined Odysseus coming to a multicultural city, Bristol, in modern times, and not liking it very much. And you can find out a bit more about the Ithaca Access following that link. I also curated the Afrofuturist film season in 2014, and that was my first introduction to Floyd Webb and Yatasha Womack, Ingrid LaFleur. These are US-based, Chicago-based Afrofuturists who've so very kindly given me their time, support, energy, and I had the pleasure to actually meet last year, apart from Ingrid. So, and you can find out a little bit more about that project, which again was delivered through the Watershed, and my article and so on. Now, I want us to share a little extract from, before we go on to share the short film, but I've been very lucky to collaborate with a bunch of lovely guys and girls. But my co-collaborators have been Alejandro Padron, Drojan Visuals, and Adam Murray, who I also work with as part of Come the Revolution, a programming group. And so in 2016, we delivered a project called The Time Machine. And that was the first time I really began to think of citing a Black lens, a Black diasporic lens within my work as a way of imagining the Afro future. And other themes began to emerge out of that, which began to make a bit more sense later on. So can we play, please, the Time Machine? You know, I thought we would be over all this, that we would have gone to a time when separation was truly over.
I thought he was brilliant. It was completely in the zone the whole time and absolutely fantastic and really engaging, and he was ad-libbing as he was going, which was brilliant. And it just made it, and it was very thought-provoking. And I thought it was really interactive, and you felt welcome, and yet you felt like there was a good divide between us and you. And I like the fact that you were very busy at all times, which is, you know, slightly disconcerting but interesting at the same time. So thank you.
No, it was great. No, it was really fun, really interesting, and very stimulating. I really enjoyed it.
Pictures of,
and especially because I got singled out and then I got let in, so it was great. No, I really enjoyed the whole sensory experience. Thank you very much.
We have at least a greater understanding of those that have gone before and what is hidden within our DNA. So, as you hopefully picked up, that was a pretty much of a sort of quite a protracted journey into performance for me. I normally prefer to give lines to other people and then get them to suffer learning and inhabiting them. But this idea, the last blues song, the Time Machine, it really seemed to make sense that myself, Alex, and Adam were, as we called it, the architects of that. So just to sort of run through the Time Machine, because it's just a stepping on point, really. We imagined the excavation of a specimen from centuries past, and this person had been excavated by a future scientific team, architects, and they want to make sense of the evolution of human consciousness. They kind of want to know, why were their ancestors so primitive? And so they follow the DNA line of this excavated person and reanimate this consciousness at each period. And what that meant in practice was that I delivered a performance every hour on the hour from 11 o'clock till 12 a.m., in which I performed the sort of different avatars of this DNA line. And it went from the first African encounters with Europeans right through to a 24th century experience in which a protagonist was debating whether or not to augment part of their bodies or whether or not they were going to be a purist and keep their body as digitally free as possible. So we took many of these ideas forward into the last Blue Song, which I began later that year, having successfully applied for and received the artist's residency bursary at the Pervasive Media Studio. And that research period allowed me to integrate my various concerns, areas of academic interest, into the groundwork for a much wider project. So one of the things that it's been referenced by Luke, is that one of my academic specialisms is about African continuities in the New World. And it's not so much in that field now really talking about continuities, but how new cultures are created by the coming together of different groups. And so one of the key ingredients of the last Blue Song is to imagine then what would happen if various different elements of the diaspora were pulled together in a colony and evolved a whole new culture based upon this African diasporic blueprint. What would we revive? What might get left behind? Also, the residency allowed me to work with a much larger team than Adam and Alex, much as I love them. But it allowed me to explore the aesthetic, the music, the dance, the philosophy of this future of this Afrofuturist world. And I brought that showcase together in my residency. So we're going to go to a clip of that trailer, which was the final kind of project, or final sort of bringing together of the last Blue Song project. And yeah, and I think that will give you really a sense of what that project involved, which will then allow me to kind of expand from there as to where we are now. So if we can play the last Blue Song trailer, please. I would describe myself as primarily a storyteller. And I say that because I began, first of all, as a poet, and around about the same time I found that I was diversifying into other forms of literature. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was writing is that there are lots of different ways of bringing the magic of theatre alive. And of course, I was beginning to become aware of technology and how it was becoming more and more featured in the theatrical world. And I had a story idea which suited this kind of residency perfectly. The last Blue Song, or Lost Afronaut, was in many ways for me a blue sky project, one which I thought I would eventually do. I kicked into the long grass, but was hoping that eventually there'd be time and space for me to be able to make it a reality. But what the residency has done for me was to make that a reality now. And I was introduced to a community of creatives who were able to give me their time, their skills, their expertise, to show me how I could not just make it happen, but to imagine broader and wider than I had initially envisaged. It began with an idea I had when I was programming a season of films exploring sci-fi, magical realism and so on, that have come together to form a genre which we call Afrofuturism. So my idea was of a space traveller, an Afronaut, who comes from a planet where all memories of Earth have been erased, and it's a sort of an African diaspora planet where cultures have come together to create something new. And they travel through space and time and come to a devastated planet, and what they uncover on the planet is the story of their own origin, a story that's been erased, a story that has been put to one side, because the ancestors, the founders of this planet, have been keen to reset the button around Black identity, Black consciousness, to escape some of the problematics of identity on Earth that have in many ways created challenges to an African diaspora sense of moving forward progressively. Inspirations for me in terms of creative work is frustration, a sense that we're sort of locked in a kind of discourse that doesn't really move us forward. The binary of race, the binary of political ideologies that don't actually vision a new way of being in a different space. What's the narrative that creates a new kind of consciousness, an honest one, but gets us to a point where we can think differently about where we want to be? And I think without thinking about where we want to be and imagining that space, then in some ways we can sort of campaign, protest, bang our heads, and not know what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think that idea of a different space is integral to the vision of the work. During the residency, I experimented with different kinds of technology. So with shadow capture, that is where I got hold of a machete, various garden tools, and my infrared image was picked up. So basically a silhouette of me was created, which we used to project. I had a 3D animation created of our spaceship. We explored virtual reality, played around with a motion capture suit as a way of telling the story. And in the end, what I did was put these together into a trailer, a live trailer. So the different elements that I'd explored, the aesthetic that I'd been working on the project, in terms of costume ideas, in terms of the look of the planet ideas, which gave us the opportunity to test the technology that we'd experimented with, to test the idea and to create a buzz around the audience. What we want to do with the next step of this project is to turn it into a full immersive performance, where the whole narrative is presented, the aesthetic is presented, and some of the technology that we want to use to really bring forward the magic of this story, which again is suggestive of the future, suggestive of an Afro-future, of our Earth in a decimated state. Okay, so I hope that gives you a good overview of the project. It's, would you believe it or not, probably much more succinct than me trying to talk it through, because I'll tell you every little detail of it. So, where are we at now with the last blues song? Oh, let me just take you a little bit back for 1 second. So this is an image which Alejandro Drojan Visuals came up with. One of the key things for us with the last blues song was to try and create this harmonious relationship between an African aesthetic and technology. So we considered what might be the aesthetic principles, but also the technological efficacy in Femi's costume. So as you see, we've sort of borrowed designs from the Ndebele people. The spaceship is based on a Ghanaian gourd and so on. So I initially had envisaged the last blues song as a theatre show. And after the residency, I was sort of thinking of steaming full ahead with the project and turning it into a theatre show and touring it around the universe. And then I sat down with my producer, who then we started to talk about what kind of costs would be involved. And well, we're thinking of in excess of 60K. And I think in hindsight, I think that's probably quite conservative. And the likelihood is that the support from Arts Council England, which would be a major contributing body, would be capped at 50. Also, support in kind would be necessary. Actually, cash in kind. Sorry, not just the service in kind, but what would be my cash contribution to that, or what other funds could I gather? And at least need to be of 20%. So that, again, significant fundraising. That combined with my starting to sort of rethink my focus on the last blues song as a theatre project. One of the things that kept coming up when I was working on the project is, what about the backstory? I kept saying, what about the backstory? Because the main thrust of the theatre project was this encounter between our Afronaut Femi, who lands on this planet and discovers the last human, which is this young white woman, and her discovery that this planet is actually one which her ancestors left millennia and millennia past. But the conversations around what's the backstory made me really First of all, I found them annoying. But eventually I began to realize that actually I was equally as fascinated by the backstory. How has this world been put together? What is Femi's planet like? What is its journey? And I thought, well, actually, this is a much broader project than the theatre show in itself. In order to arrive at the theatre show, so much more concept and word building needed to occur. So some colleagues at the Pervasive Media Studio suggested perhaps it's an academic research project in which the outcome could be a performance. I also began to consider perhaps it's a multimedia cross-platform world-building project, which would allow other people to create their sort of versions of that story. And I see this story as having 4 significant phases, and each of those 4 phases would allow other creatives to be able to create different kinds of work, whether from illustration to music of the Afrofuture. What would the music be like if you had people who were listening to funk, to classical, to Afrobeat, to samba, all suddenly over millennia creating a new sound? What would be the conditions in the instruments? All these were real, quite meaty chunks for people to get their own creative juices involved in. So could there be a platform in which there is a cross-pollination of creativity? And I explored the building of a website which could be used for that purpose. I began to then, in some ways, sort of hit a wall with where to begin. There are so many different tests, so many different ways in which I could proceed with the last blues project that I thought, well, the plethora of ideas in some ways was less helpful than having the clarity of thinking about it as a theatre project in the initial. On the other hand, the project never sort of ground to a halt. I was constantly revising and refining the idea, thinking about the possibilities of space travel, thinking about the fact that planets make music. Could the music of the Afrofuture actually also involve music making based on the vibrations of planets? And I created a Facebook page in which I sort of throw out ideas and also just collated stuff which I thought I'd use later on. Other projects arose, and they allowed me to kind of explore Afrofuturism in a different way and in a linked way in some ways. So one of those projects was in 2017, I was invited by the Arnold Feeney to do a sort of late night takeover. And I imagined the Arnold Feeney, and the Arnold Feeney is a major gallery in Bristol, the heart of the city. And I imagined that the Arnold Feeney was our Afrofuturist city, an African diasporic city, not Lagos, Atlanta, or Brixton, and apologies to any other major center of African diasporic life that feel they've been missed out. But none of these and all of these. And the Afro-metropolis, that late night, allowed me to pursue some of the concerns of the last blues song. What would be the culture of a truly pan-diasporic city? What would be its lived practice, the aesthetic, the holistic experience? Because the holistic experience for me was about a kind of an ontology in which the body and the body and the mind, the physical experience and cerebral one were not seen as intention, but in which we lived in some kind of holistic way of integrating all our fuller selves. So we had live drawing by Alejandro, which we sort of imagined the architecture of this future city. One which is environmentally friendly, which was about creating spaces of human interaction. How do we maximize human interaction? As a society by design, trying to pull away from this sort of silo and suburban living, which means that lives don't cross over. What would be, in a sense, your journey through the city? What would be your aesthetic encounter? So borrowing from Congo Square in New Orleans, we created invited artists to come together, Priscilla Anderson, one of the great artists that I'm friends with, to create a jam. And this jam was this idea that you'd be walking through the city, and as part of your daily journey, there would be musicians and poets creating work in an polymorphous, polyrhythmic way with no sense of its destination. But that would be of social value. That would be part of creating a sort of energy and life to the human soul and the human spirit within the city. And also through Floyd Webb and Yatashi Womack, we were able to curate a season of films in the Arnolfini Gallery. Each of the spaces that we created took its names from a juxtaposition of male and female leading lights within the African diasporic context today. So we had the Duvernay Senghor Theatre, Duvernay Semben, as in Semben Usman, Ava DuVernay cinema. And we replicated that throughout each of these spaces. And the photography by Lisa Whiting just captured some of those encounters here. The poetry, the jam performance, Zara, a studio resident, Zara Ash Harper, who was the facilitator for the discussion around what were the values of the Afro-diasporic, Afro-metropolis city. Another departure for me over the last few years has involved, in some ways, to put it simply, ghosts. And I hadn't kind of realized how much I'd been animated by ghost stories in this series of departures. And then actually in preparing this paper, I've realized that at the heart of the ghost story of the Last Blues Song is a ghost story. And this idea that within ghost lore, the dead do not rest unless the crimes committed against them can be atoned. And then this has led to a whole genealogy of myth around African cities based at the bottom of the Atlantic where slaves were thrown overboard. But for my journeys, what I've done is kind of, in a sense, revived important figures from Black diasporic history. So in 2018, I worked with Bristol Vic and wrote a series of speeches that were performed by actors and international and locally known leaders, including our Bristol mayor, elected Mayor Marvin Rees, in which we imagined that Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist, had come back to life, given his view on Bristol and where currently inequality lies, and sort of passed judgment on us. And I picked Frederick Douglass because in some ways he was way ahead of his time at the point in the 19th century when he was writing. He was a visionary, and also in some ways he was nobody's person. I think he wasn't sort of struggling with, there was a sense of a searching for a kind of truth that was beyond the claims of any particular faction, black or white. Also in 2017 onwards, I created a character which was broadcast on through a series of plays on Radio 4, called Deacon. And Deacon imagines a former preacher on a slave plantation who's been cursed with immortality. Not only that, but he's responsible for a congregation that died under his watch. And so he's the umbilical link between them and this monochrome world in which they habit and the real world. And in each episode, Deacon encounters a protagonist who is at some sort of crossroads in their lives, and his intervention forces them to consider what they're doing, the choices they're making, and to face those in one way or the other. So he is almost like a Legba figure, person at the crossroads, but also he's in conflict with the gods, the African gods, which he's being punished by for his departure into Christianity. But he is in some ways a ghost, like Frederick Douglass returns as a sort of living ghost as well. And this is another aspect of Afrofuturism. It's not just in some ways about sci-fi, but also a broader reimagining, which can entail the supernatural as well. A project which has been postponed, Unfinished Business, which was a look at the St. Paul's riot, a commemoration of the St. Paul's riot in 1980, also involved a series of monologues which I wrote and were going to be directed by Nancy Medina, in which a character called Serena, again, passes judgment on our era but also inhabits a Black radical revolutionary spirit across time. Although when we look to the future, she is tired of this binary fight with white power. So in some ways, what I thought were departures kind of helped me to make sense of where I was at with the last blues song. I have described in some ways a kind of a sort of struggle with what are the ways forward with this idea that's grown and grown and proliferated. What test to do first? And I thought it was important to test the tech. The last blues song trailer, which some of you saw, involved, and what the key reason for being at the Pervasive Media is to be able to pull in a skill set around technology and theatre that wasn't part of my my background beforehand, and those skill sets lay with other wonderful creative people. So I wanted to be able to expand that. I thought any future test needs to be able to look at the concept and see how we can bring it to life. How can the magic of technology be used to creatively enhance what we're trying to achieve in bringing the last blues song to life? I wanted it to be a progressive step forward, not to just sort of rehash a trailer that's been done. It needed to be a viable test because it might be several. And so a 15K max grant. Also, I kind of feel a little bit guilty as a creative that I've been talking about this project for so long, and maybe thinking that other studio residents are wondering, what's he actually doing? So again, this was, I was thinking of a way in which we could keep interest alive, revive and reconnect people to the development in the project. And so in some ways, the idea of the ghost really helped me to kind of develop what would be the next step. And that was also confirmed by a visit to Chicago last year, funded by British Council, supported by Festival of Ideas, to visit Chicago and talk to some of the leader Afrofuturists, just to kind of meet people face to face, pick up different ideas. So I've cited Yatasha Womack and Floyd Webb, many others, Mojada Stokely, who I was able to kind of joust with, share ideas with, Samuel Lewis, Jonathan Woods. And in some ways, I left Chicago even more convinced that the way forward was to see the last blues song as a life project. And even if, and I think for the sake of my sanity, I definitely want to see the sort of theatre version in the next couple of years, but actually not to see it as a closed project in that regard, but as a broad explorational vision of exploring those potentialities of what an Afro future will look like, not as a form of escapism, but to kind of remind us of what it is we're trying to achieve, rather than, in a sense, an essentially struggle of one power or ontology over the other. But how can we arrive at a new space based on excavating some of that African diasporic past? And so the installation idea would have involved Femi, our Afronaut, landing on Earth, and in some ways being met by the ghosts of her past, the ghost of an ancestral line that she's not aware of, using digital projection, shadow capture, and so on. But really working out how the tech could bring to life in the best way possible this idea of the ghost surrounding her. But also the audio environment, her costume, again, would be all ways of playing with what would be the aesthetic of the Afro future. These were just some of the inspirations from Chicago. There are so many that I can't revisit them all. But I went to the Museum of Science and Industry, and the curators were absolutely wonderful. Took me around and gave me free pass to the exhibition on wearable technology, where I saw a lightweight spacesuit. It was so lightweight that it again gave me, made me feel that there was some credibility in what the future shape of an African diasporic costume, which Femi would be wearing, would look like, both in terms of functionality and aesthetic. But also some of the designs within traditional African cultures, like the mask you see, lend themselves also to a way in which a space helmet could both, in a sense, be used to convey an aesthetic, but also information. What if a Femi suit said all that needed to be ever said about her and her society, just in terms of what was coded within that suit? What if also that the aesthetic of the suit, the mask, was meant to convey, in her understanding, a particular set of values and so on? And she has no idea that whatever intelligent life she finds out there has no way of coding or decoding how she sees the world. So I think these are just a couple of slides that give you a broader sense of the last Blue Song project in the past. But I want to kind of leave it there and leave it open for some questions.
Hey, Edson, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. There are already some questions already, so we can dive straight in. Camille Aubrey asks, your work highlights the importance of multidisciplinary projects. I was wondering if you could expand on that and if you had other disciplines in mind you'd like to experiment with.
So, gosh. So in some ways, so as a theatre maker, I realized that collaboration is essential to making work happen. And I do believe in some ways in the genius of different creatives. So my role in the last Blue Song, in some ways in working in poetry, of course, it's the most autonomous medium in some ways for a poet, unless you've got some bullying editor. But in ways, for things to really take flesh and form, it does rely on the genius of other creatives. So my role is as a sort of the creative lead, but in a sense more to supply a brief and then for others to be able to really take that ball and run with it. One of the challenges actually with the last Blue Song is to try and keep that blue sky thinking around African potentialities alive. I think when we are so rooted in our contemporary context, sometimes our first urge is to sort of think about today's concerns and how they can be flipped and changed. And what I often think about, well, so to give an example, initial conversations with choreographers, oh, there's a wonderful hip hop group that's in London, or they'd be fantastic to work with. There's a wonderful samba group, and you're okay. Imagine none of that exists. This is a future world in which it doesn't exist. So any sense of real immersion in the medium needs to, in some ways, have a grounding and then throw it all away and start again. I can't do that because, my dance vocabulary is pretty limited. But I think, and this is the importance of having like different labs and tests, giving people a chance to play and say, right, these are moves and signature phrases that we might see survive and radically changed in different conditions. So it's absolutely essential to have that multidisciplinary approach, because in a sense, otherwise that world will look as if it's the author. And what I want it to do as much as possible is to kind of not look like Edson, that I kind of create a platform. And Femi, in some ways, I know this is one of the challenges that as a real world person living now, there is still going to be too much of contemporary Edson. So this is an exercise envisioning with its limitations that, obviously we start from. But I think it's worth doing because it's about trying to posit different spaces. Gosh, there is a sense, no medium that I would kind of exclude. So I don't know, because we are talking about a different world. We are talking about complete different worlds. What would lovemaking be like in the future? I don't know. What would food and cuisine would be really important. And I've talked to a couple of potential collaborators around food creation. And if we imagine, for example, this colony leaving Earth in this huge spaceship, they might not be able to take food with them, but they might be able to take, or even if you do, how do you preserve a sense of smell? So I know that there are food technologists who are had some conversations with around how you can create tastes or smells and tastes and so on, even synthetically. And if nothing else, there might be ways of preserving that. In terms of the environment of the spaceship as well, one of the things I saw in Chicago was vertical farming. So if you imagine a ship of a particular size and space, then maybe the way in which you keep organic life alive on this ship is through vertical farming. And what kind of food would be possible to reproduce and be so nutritious at such a rate that it would be possible for it to exist. So there are multiple conversations that exist through the Last Blue Song. And of course, it's the toss-up is between science fantasy and science fact, that to what extent do I want this to have some kind of linkage to what is possible in the next 2 centuries? To what extent is it, look, let's just magically reel and just do this as it's possible? But I always like to think that if there's a conversation there where there can be a gist of credibility, it gives us all another room to play. It brings in a different discourse as well.
Tom Marshman asks, do you think using creative tech helps you to tell ghost stories more earnestly?
We'll wait. I think it's the effect. So I wouldn't say there's no technology greater, I think, than the human body in performance. But the human body in performance can be enhanced in interaction with technology. So what I'd like to do, my vision for the Last Blue Song, is to create an immersive environment in which those ghosts are so real and so frightening that, in a sense, we're taken to another place. That it's yeah. So the proof is in how efficacious it is, and that's the test. If it doesn't work, if we find that actually we're thinking about this as a layer of technology rather than immersive, then perhaps it's about scaling it back in some ways. But I've seen some wonderful examples of the use of projection mapping and so on to create those ghostly experiences. Citing called Sharon Clark and the work that she does as a fellow student resident and someone whose work I much admire. So I think it's possible to tell it more honestly, but it's about the testing to do that. Yeah.
Great. We are rapidly running out of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze a few more in.
Okay.
Let's go with Claire Turner asks, are there surprising things which you've discovered through experiencing, I mean, this is going to be a hard one to answer quickly, but are there surprising things which you've discovered through exploring potentiality and visioning in your work? I want to try and squeeze a couple more in, Edson, so if you can. I mean, I know these are big questions.
Yeah. The only surprising thing, yes, a couple of things that I've discovered is that there's technology on the horizon that's being posited that is much closer to what I was imagining than I realized. So I think I'd come up with an idea, imagine that, and then one of the fellow residents would say, oh, well, we're actually working on this. So, yeah, so sometimes it's actually, one isn't as far ahead as the curve. It's about having conversations as broadly as possible to realize what things are on the horizon, what stuff is happening in tech. But the other thing I've discovered, to be honest, is that I also need to broaden my own mind. I was a bit stubborn about expanding this into a life project initially, because I kind of want to get it done and move on to the next thing. So the discovery is also about letting go and seeing and repositioning oneself within a creative process.
Great, thank you. So a couple more quickly. Lena B. Frank asks, she says she's interested in the idea of recognizing existing binaries and consciously working to reject them. Hope she understood. She says she hopes she understood that right. Have you found any informal or formal methods that support you in this quest?
Yes and no. In some ways, it's more. I'm going to have to get back to Lena. Lena, that's such a deep question. I'm going to get back to you. I guess in some ways, when we talk about lived practice, it's the encounters one has with communities and people who are sometimes not so much concerned with the formal activist language, but how their lived practice can show you different ways of being, different ways of acting and living. Sometimes there's a kind of an assurance and a visionary lived self that it isn't in some ways about wearing that, but the practice of it. That's quite powerful. Yeah, and that's been more informal than formal, I'd say.
Sure. So final question then, and apologies to anyone who hasn't had their question asked. There will be a slide at the end which will show you ways you can reach out to Edson to continue the conversation beyond this. But Edson, finally, because this one is themed to the current times we're in, how has lockdown impacted your current work, or has it offered you any new sources of inspiration?
Yes, in some ways, what it has done is allowed me to. So, as a freelancer, as a creative, often there are wonderful opportunities for work, but they're not always necessarily our blue sky project, the project that we have to generate ourselves. And so, in the lockdown, I've been able to kind of return to some of those things that have been on the back burner. I've done some rethinking around the last blue song, and I'm going to start scripting. And in some ways, I think it's affirmed my sense, sadly, I'd say, that even in a crisis, we suffer in our silos, that the language around COVID, the responses to COVID, say so much about our pre-COVID world. And I have to be honest, that I'm not that hopeful that we will reimagine ourselves in a new space. Because what it has done is actually exposed and stripped a layer of how we have lived contemporaneously. The arguments and discussions we've had, even to the levels of conspiracy theories, they have been very much along the lines of targeting or being based on particular kinds of problematics or concerns, or even communities. So it's even more important, I think, to insist on vision, even more important to think through what those future spaces can be. Because if we don't institute them, they don't happen inevitably. It's as if we're kind of down, what COVID has shown, that we are down certain trajectories of understanding, even to cite the response to it within a sort of Second World War language and tone. It erases the problematics of Churchill, for example, doesn't look at the realities of both the beauty of humanity in that response, but also the ways in which a nation was fragmented. So in some ways, I think we have to be kind of very careful about the way in which these narratives have been adopted to really insist upon a truly visionary way of looking. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty emphatic note to end on there, Edson.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edson. For anyone who wants to find out more about our future talks, you can follow us on @PMStudioUK on Twitter, or subscribe to the newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a little thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. So also please share the link with your friends if they missed it. It'll be up here for as long as our YouTube channel is in existence. You can share it and share Edson's words and story.